think Eduardo Paolozzi is one of the most interesting, important and relevant artists from Britain in the second half of the 20th century.
Paolozzi is one of those artists who's been one of the founding figures of pop art.
There's much to discover about Paolozzi. He's still much underrated.
I have a suspicion people on the Central Line platforms have been picking bits of mosaic off as souvenirs for about 23 years.
If I was to try and remember what drew me to them, it was colour.
They give that vibrancy and that life, and they're part of our history.
The Tube has always been about more than just getting people from A to B. It's a part of London, it's how London grows.
It's a massive civil engineering project, so what we're doing is, insignificant, but it's really important and it's really interesting, yeah.
They were tiling the ceilings, tiling the floors, electrical kind of conduit going up, running electrical wires everywhere.
With it being so fragile, we just took our time, didn't want to rush it. There was no rush, we didn't need to rush, just to get it back as it should be.
Eduardo Paolozzi was born in 1924 in Leith, the port of Edinburgh. He moved to London very quickly after the war, becoming a practitioner who worked very intuitively to find his own way in the art world. He lived in Paris, he met the Surrealists, and very, very quickly became one of the most important artists from Britain.
I met him actually when he was old and rather ill, and he couldn't actually speak anymore, but he came to the Tate Gallery where I was working as a curator. I remember taking him through the galleries, and he sort of indicated that he wanted to stop in front of a drawing by Picasso, and he managed to heave himself out of the wheeled chair trying to come and have a look at this drawing. It was an extremely moving moment for this man who, actually an important artist himself, reduced as he was, but still very, very involved mentally with this world.
I think Eduardo Paolozzi was an extremely generous artist. A lot of his artworks were actually conceived and made for the public sphere, not just to be enjoyed by the few, but actually to be interacted with by the many. I think that's what attracted him to the mosaic as a medium and to the idea of making public works of art for one of the busiest places in London.
The work that Paolozzi undertook in the 80s at Tottenham Court Road, of course, was part of a bigger programme by the Underground at the time. Paolozzi was involved in these mosaics from concept through to actual execution and construction on the station, between 1981 and 1984. They're scattered throughout the station, at all three levels of the station, and that was actually quite unique.
It's of course a very, very large work. It covers an extremely large area, sort of 950 square metres, and you can see a really interesting differentiation in styles there. You see quite a more monochrome sections along the Northern Line with a very regular square tesserae, which in a way Paolozzi commented at the time links back to the Northern Line's identity, of course, as the black line, as the more monochrome line. When you look to the Central Line, which is a bright red line, we see a kind of riot of colour. But not only do you have these very long works along the platform, you then also find them in interconnecting spaces. Particularly, you can find a number of moths and butterflies above doors. There's the particularly exciting space, which we often refer to as the rotunda, which is a circular space, which became a bit more representational about 20th century living.
They're probably the most significant public pop art murals in the UK, certainly, probably in Europe and potentially in the world.
Tottenham Court Road is a really important station for us because London's population growth is expanding so rapidly. With Crossrail 2 coming along and Crossrail 1, Tottenham Court Road needs to expand by about 4 times the size it is at the moment. And it needs to accommodate a huge amount of growth in central London.
We're basically upgrading Tottenham Court Road station. It's over 100 years old. We're doing a full overhaul and integrating it with the Crossrail tunnel.
I first heard about the new plans for the Tottenham Court Road station in 2007. At the time, I was working as curator at the National Galleries of Scotland, taking care of the Paolozzi collection. The team from Transport of London actually came up to visit me in Scotland, and they really wanted to understand how the artist works, how his artworks operated. Frankly, I thought that was an excellent approach, and that took place a long time before the actual project at Tottenham Court Road station started.
Well, we were contacted in 2011 by Transport for London, who asked us to come in and to see what they were proposing to do as part of the Crossrail development over Tottenham Court Road station, and how that would affect the platforms where Paolozzi's work was and the mosaics in the other parts of the station too.
It was a little disconcerting to see really some of the public reaction. We had to spend an awful lot of time convincing people that, you know, these mosaics in total were not on a barge on their way to the Essex marshes with the rest of the Crossrail spoiled.
The media's response was slightly misleading in the sense that it gave the impression that all the mosaics at Tottenham Court Road were going to be lost, or that TfL didn't take its responsibilities for them seriously.
We were very aware of their popularity, we were very aware of their importance, you know, because they're important to us in London Underground, they're part of our DNA. It took some considerable amount of time, of course, for the public to realise that, you know, we were actually enhancing and restoring the mosaics.
We were involved with everything where there was likely to be disruption. So from the Oxford Street entrance to the mosaics over the escalators down to the platforms.
We'd made the very conscious decision to keep the Paolozzi mosaics as much as possible on the station. But we recognised, of course, by moving entrances, by moving staircases, that there were quite significant aspects of work that would need to be changed on both sets of platforms.
The question was then, what were we to do with those sections and also the areas around them, which would inevitably be damaged by the work that was being proposed.
Certainly talking to Toby and talking to Duncan Lamb, who of course had worked on the mosaics with Eduardo Paolozzi, I think we started to gain a real insight actually into how Paolozzi had viewed the works themselves and how they fitted together in a very fluid way. You know, that idea of flexibility worked in our favour when it came to making some decisions about actually where we might move component parts, how we might extend component parts.
It has required excellent photographic surveys of the mosaics in situ, which was done before any works were undertaken.
One of the things that TfL wanted to do was to salvage as many of the tiles as possible and just reuse them. But in some cases, naturally, tiles were destroyed and they had to be replaced.
We went back to Italy to talk to the people who've made the original Tesserae mosaics, and we went through very arduous matching to make sure that we were happy with the colours.
We would, sit down with these trays of tiles and look at the original and then look at the new one and decide whether that was a good enough match or not. And if it wasn't, TfL went back to the manufacturer and they were asked to see if they could make a better match.
We were really very dogged and very determined, and the craftsmen, as well as the Paolozzi Foundation who've worked on this, have really ensured that we do have the closest possible conservation-led approach to the restoration of these mosaics. They are there, they still tell the same story, they still have the intent as well as the original design that Paolozzi always intended them to have.
Paolozzi was a very visual person. When he grew up in Edinburgh in the 1920s and 30s, his parents actually had a sweet shop. And there's always arrangements of colourful sweets, of colourful wrappers, of all kinds of advertisements that would have been arranged into form, that would have been repurposed. And I think that playful approach to shape, to colour, to form is very dear to Paolozzi. One of the main themes in the work of Eduardo Paolozzi is the idea of collage. He loved magazines, he loved newspapers, and he loved the images and the photographs in these magazines. And very often these images that were torn out of popular magazines and out of vernacular culture would be then collaged together to make new images and to make new forms and shapes.
He was, to a certain extent, a pioneer of that in Britain. Paolozzi is one of those artists who's been one of the founding figures of pop art.
These are very strong, relevant images to London, to the changing times of the 1980s and the growing consumer electronics boom, but also they're still so relevant now, I feel, to our lives, to this sense of where does the human fit in the city, in the urban jungle. There's a man that's running in the rotunda, which Paolozzi described almost as the everyman, the Orwellian commuter. That's you running through the stations every day as you live your life.
Paolozzi would return to ideas or to images which he had first used many, many years before, but modernising them to a certain extent and recasting them.
So the only area really that didn't see any significant physical change is the rotunda at the bottom of the escalators.
The most complex issue for us was how to deal with the areas over the escalators where we couldn't keep the arches in situ.
The entire physical area of the station was going, it was being removed as part of the reconstruction. The new ticket hall is 6 times the size of the original. Even the roof was going at that part of the station.
We've come up with a really wonderful response, which is to move those fragments to Edinburgh, which is a university where Paolozzi both studied in 1943 but also taught later as a professor, and allow those students to take on that challenge of what is the correct thing to do when you remove a work of art from its original in situ location.
I think that all of the trustees were extraordinarily impressed by TFL. They considered the mosaics to be an important part of the station and that they were prepared to spend the time and the money to preserve them as best they could.
Mosaics are a very, very old technique that in Europe have a very strong tradition that actually has a lot to do with Italy. They have a tremendous lifespan. They're not just images, they are actually tactile, haptic things that have a beautiful quality to them that shine and glisten in the light.
We see larger, irregular shapes as well as a lot of iridescence, sort of real rich, jewel-like quality to the mosaic.
And I think that quality of having a certain sparkle and a certain magic to them is something that attracted Paolozzi.
The idea of decoration in public space is quite an interesting one. And I think by using mosaic, which is something that of course has a very long history of use as a form of public decoration in civic buildings, Paolozzi was saying that these spaces are worthy of that amount of decoration, of joy, of bringing this texture.
Paolozzi was a very, very confident artist. I think he knew what he wanted and he knew what he was interested in. It is really the idea of man and machine, and it's also the idea of pattern and ornament that almost plays like a background music. And I think that notion of music, of rhythm, of syncopation is really reflected in the almost jazzy composition of Paolozzi's Tottenham Court Road murals.
The Paolozzi mosaics are amazing, but there are some signature pieces that we looked to protect in particular, and they had to be relocated on other parts of the station. The church window, as it's kind of notionally called, is one particularly important piece.
I consider it, anyway at least, to be a sort of introduction to what you are about to descend into when you go down into the Paolozzi mosaics.
As part of the redevelopment, the building itself, that entrance, had to be demolished, and therefore we had to salvage the mosaic in one piece, get it out of there and put it somewhere sensible where it can be kind of appreciated.
We found this wonderful alcove that's part of the lower tunnels that have been created in the upgrade work, where we'd be able to place the whole arch structure with good lighting applied to it.
If you drew a straight line, it would probably be 6 stories underground basically, and then obviously turned around 180 degrees. But in doing that, it's gone out onto the street, around, into a yard, down a lift shaft.
Well, I've been in this game 37 years. This is the first time I've sliced a mosaic off the wall.
The first challenge is how do you physically cut sort of a 30mm mosaic slither off the wall and keep it in one piece, keeping in mind that it's 2 meters wide, 3 meters high.
The first meeting was just kind of pointing at this thing on the wall and said, this needs to be moved as one downstairs 7 floors. I thought, yeah, I thought I'd definitely do that.
The plans for moving the object changed quite a lot. It was quite a collaborative process. Ultimately, it was decided that we were going to use a lifting frame. It actually simplified the job.
For it to get downstairs, it did go through pretty much every movement you could imagine, or every possible movement, upside, downside, across, angles.
So all of those stresses are acting on this mosaic in different ways that it's never been expected to perform in. So the idea was to build a cradle that would act in taking all of those stresses away from the mosaic itself and acting on the frame rather than the mosaic.
Initially, we thought it would be fairly simple, I think. And that certainly wasn't the case as we sort of got further in on the job.
The specialist art handlers are very used to having control of a process, doing it their own way, having a calm environment, a clean environment, a lot of time to work with, which we can't accommodate as easily just being a construction site. We're targeting some pretty hard dates with Crossrail planned to open up in the near future.
Crossrail is a massive engineering project and there's so many parts to it.
What we're doing is, in a way, insignificant in terms of the sort of stuff that TWN have been doing, but it's it's really important and it's really interesting. Yeah.
There's a real onus on speed and execution for construction, and time is money, whereas it is for us, but there are certain other factors that have to be considered a lot more, like looking after the object correctly. The first process was to document the mosaic thoroughly. We did loads of rubbings, loads of photographs, so it was really well documented in case it kind of completely collapsed or shattered and we might have had to restore it completely. It was cleaned initially just to remove any kind of residual dirt and dust that were just on the surface that would stop the adhesive layers that we were putting on top bonding properly to the surface of the tesseract.
And then the paraloid layer, which was the first layer that went on, with the Japanese tissue on. That was there almost like an extra skin to the mosaic tesseract before all the other materials went on. The silicon layer was to take out any vibrations and dangerous movement.
The way I thought about it was that it was like building a wall, a removable and reversible wall onto the face of the mosaic, so that when you cut away the back, you created a really strong structural wall in front of it that would support the mosaic. The problem being that as we took it off the wall, it had to go face down. And in that process, it's spanning 3 meters, there's a lot of room for the middle of the mosaic to kind of slump quite a lot. So we definitely needed a frame that was rigid enough to take all those stresses away and minimise those so as to reduce cracking in the actual mosaic itself.
Cutting something like that off the wall presents an interesting challenge. We're cutting 30mm is nothing, and we're cutting with a diamond wire that's 10mm thick. It is a wire, it can wave as it goes through the mosaic, so there is a huge amount of risk.
We protect it to a maximum level so that nothing can go wrong, in theory. Of course, we can have terrible accidents.
In this instance, you've suddenly got about 1.5 tons, which, once you've cut it off a wall, is just kind of floating in mid-air.
What you're thinking about when you're lifting something is where you want it to go and how the object's going to behave.
First thing you want to do is get it down to the ground as soon as possible, because as soon as it's on the ground, then you're safe, essentially.
The day we took this out of ground floor, they started demolishing the building. So time was of the essence.
We got it off the wall, put it onto a dolly and brought it round to our yard. The final challenge was getting it underground.
Seeing that item come off and dropping down, I say dropping, very carefully, being moved down a lift shaft. It was a real tense moment for the whole team.
Well, part of it's trusting what we've done and how we've wrapped it. And we know what tolerance it can take. We know the protection we gave it should have meant it could tolerate almost any movement.
So in terms of the installation of the object, that was the tricky bit, and obviously then it's the bit that everyone wants to see as well, so suddenly you have a much bigger crowd, which is always good fun.
We were completely blind to the piece, obviously. We couldn't actually see any tesseract. My only nerves were that our system of recording the level were correct. It was the only thing at the back of my mind was, oh gosh, is it exactly as it's meant to be and where it's meant to be?
You wouldn't want to have in posterity a slightly wonky, sculpture that you've installed that you can show to all of your children, and yeah.
Yeah, it was perfect. It was great. It was exactly level.
Once we got on the wall, actually take in, we didn't know how our adhesive would come off the mosaic, and in the end it came off pretty easily, to be fair, pretty easy. So the restoration guys definitely knew what they were doing.
My worst fear in this whole process is definitely unveiling it at the end and having a big crack in it somewhere.
It was lovely to see it when it was kind of completely unveiled. That was great, just to see it in its new location. It's kind of like a reveal.
The artwork works on so many levels. You can read it as component parts. You can read it as an entire narrative running through the station if you get the chance. It's not just the pop art medium and media, it's about actually the content, the story it tells.
But also including other artworks as well, such as the Daniel Buren pieces and the new Crossrail art that's coming along. They'll come together to make that station a really unique environment.
In a train station, people are generally in such a rush that it's more of it can be a very subconscious thing. Maybe there should be a little text panel that says, how much of a project it was.
It's framed beautifully with the wall structure around it. It's got beautiful lighting.
But it feels like it's got its own kind of gallery almost in that square.
What I do enjoy the most is really when you see passengers stopping and they're just amazed by it, which is always a nice reminder of what you've managed to leave behind.
Together we made a good team. I can walk past here in 20 years' time and go, yeah, I have to stick that on the wall.
Looking back on it, I feel professionally that we have done the right thing by Paolozzi and the Mosaics.